Hey guys, tonight we walk into the dry hush of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets sleep under museum lights and broken wedge marks still seem to murmur about God's city's fear and memory. Our subject is a strange one, the idea that cuneiform texts may preserve, however faintly, the story of the Anunnaki leaving Earth after a war they could not win. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm what-if imagination, the kind that lingers at the edge of old stories like candlelight on stone. Historians debate archaeology suggests, and the evidence we do have points to a world far more complex than internet myths usually allow. You probably won't survive this as a Bronze Age scribe, by the way, mostly because your back would give up before your spirit did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in imagination, at least beside a table of fired clay. The tablets are smaller than modern legends like to pretend. They do not glow, they do not hum, they do not politely unfold a grand secret in one clean paragraph. They sit there with the stubborn dignity of old paperwork, which in many ways is exactly what they are. Most historians agree that cuneiform writing emerged in ancient Mesopotamia for practical reasons, first tied to accounting, administration, grain labor, and offerings. The world begins, as it so often does, with lists: sheep, beer, barley, temple rations. Humanity truly has always loved a spreadsheet, only now it came pressed into mud. And yet over time those same wedge-shaped signs carried myths, prayers, epics, laments, royal boasts, and uneasy conversations about the gods. Archaeology suggests that the cities of Sumer and later Mesopotamia developed rich temple cultures in which divine beings were not distant abstractions but woven into daily life. The gods owned land, received food, demanded songs, and legitimized kings. Among these beings appear the Anunnaki, a group whose name has inspired enormous fascination in the modern world, not all of it especially careful. What's broadly accepted is that in Mesopotamian religion, the Anunnaki were divine figures associated in different texts with high gods, underworld judges, cosmic order, and the structure of the universe. They are not described in one single master text that explains everything neatly. That would be far too convenient, and ancient Mesopotamia was rarely interested in being convenient for 21st century curiosity. Instead, references are scattered. Meanings shift. Context matters. City traditions differ. Copies vary. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. This is where a modern listener often meets the first disappointment, which is also the first relief. No surviving cuneiform tablet simply says in plain modern English that the Anunnaki lost a war and boarded the nearest celestial exit. That is not what the tablets literally give us. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do preserve stories of divine conflict, disorder, withdrawal, punishment, and separation between gods and humans, but linking all of that to a single narrative of departure after defeat is a later interpretation, not a settled historical conclusion. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the mystery does not disappear just because it refuses to dress itself in certainty. In some ways it becomes more interesting. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. A careful reading might suggest that ancient Mesopotamian myths remember moments when divine order felt unstable. Gods argue, plans change, floods come, cities fall. Sacred favor seems to shift like wind over river reeds. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. To understand why later readers began imagining retreat, exile, or departure, you first have to enter the atmosphere of those old texts. Picture southern Mesopotamia, not as endless fantasy darkness, but as light heat dust canals, reeds, oxen kilns, fish, smell wet mud, drying on sandals, and temple stairways rising above packed earth neighborhoods. Most historians agree that early cities such as Uruk-ur, Eridu Lagash, and Nippur were real urban centers with organized labor, monumental architecture, priestly institutions, and long traditions of worship. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that was astonishingly skilled, deeply religious, and also extremely familiar with stress. Flooding drought warfare labor demands crop uncertainty, not exactly a spa weekend. Inside this tense but brilliant world, stories about the gods served many purposes. They explained why people worked, why kings ruled, why rivers mattered, why disorder threatened everything, and why humans could never feel completely secure. One interpretation is that these myths also absorb the emotional weather of city life. If your world feels fragile, your gods may start sounding restless too. If rival cities compete, their divine patrons may begin to resemble rival courts. If empires rise and fall, heaven itself can start to feel political. Historians still argue whether divine conflict in Mesopotamian literature should be read mainly as symbolic theology, reflections of earthly politics, echoes of older oral traditions, or some blend of all three. That uncertainty matters. It keeps us honest. A more cautious explanation could be that stories later linked to the Anunnaki leaving Earth were originally literary ways of thinking about cosmic balance, human suffering, and the distance between sacred ideals and messy reality. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another path opens. What if later readers noticed not one dramatic statement, but a pattern? A sense that the divine world in Mesopotamian texts sometimes appears embattled, then remote, present, then withdrawn, loud, then strangely silent, not gone in any simple sense, but less accessible, less stable, less willing to remain close. A fringe idea proposes that these patterns preserve memory of literal non-human rulers leaving the earth after a failed conflict. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it turns scattered tensions into a cinematic story. It gives modern audiences a clean plot. Powerful beings arrive, struggle, lose control, and depart. Human beings adore a good exit scene, preferably one with dramatic weather and a soundtrack. Ancient scribes sadly left no soundtrack, though you can almost hear styluses scratching like dry insects in the dark. The more grounded view is subtler, and maybe more haunting. The texts suggest a world in which contact with the divine always feels negotiated, partial, and vulnerable to rupture. Gods can bless, but they can also turn away. Temples can thrive, but they can also fall quiet. Ritual can bridge heaven and earth, but not always in ways humans fully understand. One interpretation is that later stories of the Anunnaki leaving Earth grew from this older emotional truth, the frightening possibility that sacred order might not stay put. And that is where you begin tonight, not with a spaceship hidden in a museum basement, sorry to anyone who came prepared for that, but with clay silence and a puzzle, a real civilization, real texts, real gods in the minds of real ancient people. Around them gathers a much later mist of theory, rumour, and imaginative reconstruction. A popular rumour claims those tablets reveal a hidden account of celestial defeat. What's broadly accepted is more modest, but still compelling. Mesopotamian literature remembers conflict among divine powers, instability in cosmic order, and the uneasy distance between heaven and the human world. What if the stories are pointing at something else? What if departure is not one event but a feeling preserved across centuries, the sense that the old closeness had faded, and something mighty had stepped back beyond reach? That question hangs in the warm air like dust above a temple floor, and you follow it deeper into the cities, where the gods once seemed close enough to feed praise, fear, and perhaps one day lose. You move deeper into the city before sunrise, when Mesopotamia is still half blue and half bronze, and the air holds that brief mercy before the heat begins its daily campaign against human dignity. The canals lie dark and still, reeds whisper at their edges. Somewhere a donkey complains with the emotional sincerity of a professional critic. Ahead of you, the temple platform rises above the low mud-brick houses, and even in the dim light, it tells you what matters here. Most historians agree that Sumerian and later Mesopotamian cities were organized around temple institutions that were economic, religious, and political at once. Archaeology suggests that these were not merely places for private devotion. They were engines of storage, labor distribution, record-keeping, and identity. The city does not just have a god. In a sense, the city belongs to that god. You feel that truth in the layout itself. Homes crowd together in winding lanes. Workshops breathe out smoke and kiln heat. Bread ovens wake early. Fish, wool, damp clay, and stale beer mingle into the sort of perfume no luxury brand has yet dared to market. At the centre, or on a commanding platform, sits the sacred complex, taller, better supplied and more deliberate than everything around it. What's broadly accepted is that temple households controlled land livestock craft production and rations on a large scale. The evidence we do have points to a society where religion and administration were not neat separate departments. They were roommates who borrowed each other's sandals. Inside the temple precincts, scribes keep lists. Priests oversee offerings, labourers haul goods, and officials calculate who owes what to whom. Cuneiform tablets record barley allocations, animal counts, brewing supplies, and workforce obligations with the determined patience of people who know. Civilization collapses the minute someone stops tracking grain. You can almost hear the stylus tips clicking into damp clay, one wedge at a time, as if order itself must be pressed into the earth before it evaporates. And maybe in a way that is exactly what is happening. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion did not imagine the gods as abstract moral concepts floating in pleasant clouds. These were powerful beings with households' preferences, rivalries, tempers, cities, and domains. Enlil is bound to Nippur, Inanna to Uruk, Enki to Eridu, Nanna to Ur. The divine map overlaps the human one. A careful reading might suggest that this arrangement reflects more than belief alone. It also mirrors political life. If cities compete, their gods can seem to compete. If dynasties rise and fall, divine favour may appear to move with them. If a city suffers famine, conquest, or neglect, it can feel as though its god has weakened, withdrawn, or at least stopped answering emails. This matters for the Anunnaki question because later theories often flatten Mesopotamian religion into a single clean hierarchy like a corporate org chart from outer space. Ancient texts are much messier. What's broadly accepted is that the term Anunnaki appears in different contexts and does not always refer to one fixed caste behaving in one consistent way across all periods. Sometimes the group seems connected to great gods, sometimes to underworld judgment. Sometimes the lines are frustratingly brief because ancient scribes apparently enjoyed the art of being cryptic just enough to ruin future documentaries. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally understood as a specific divine assembly, a flexible title for powerful gods, or a concept that changed significantly over time and across regions. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the evidence. It is part of the evidence. Real traditions evolve. Real scribal cultures copy, adapt, reinterpret, and occasionally contradict themselves. A more cautious explanation could be that later readers mistook this shifting complexity for a hidden secret when in fact it reflects the ordinary untidiness of long-lived religions. Still, if you stand in one of these cities long enough, you begin to understand why dramatic theories take hold. The atmosphere practically invites them. The temple is not simply symbolic. It is the place where heaven and earth are expected to meet through ritual. Offerings are prepared, hymns are sung, incense drifts upward, and statues are tended as if the divine presence is genuinely there. Archaeology suggests that cult images in Mesopotamia were treated with extraordinary seriousness. They were clothed, washed, fed, and ceremonially cared for. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which divine absence would not feel philosophical. It would feel administrative, agricultural, emotional, and terrifyingly practical. Imagine a season in which rituals continue but confidence weakens. The bread is set out, the chants are spoken, the oil is poured, yet the city remains anxious. Floods arrive at the wrong time, enemies press in, trade wobbles, crops fail. One interpretation is that myths of divine conflict and withdrawal gained power because city life itself was so vulnerable. If your world depends on sacred order, then any instability in the divine realm becomes a matter of public concern. What if the crowded streets below were living through the first tremors of a war in heaven without knowing it? That is imagination. Yes, but it grows from a documented truth. Urban life in Mesopotamia was fragile enough to make cosmic anxiety feel painfully relevant. As the sun rises, the city becomes noisier. Potters shout, goats negotiate badly, water jars knock against one another in steady rhythm. Children dart between doorways with the boundless confidence of people who have never filed a tax tablet in their lives. And above them all, the temple remains both reassurance and reminder. It says the cosmos has structure. It also says you are not in charge of it. Bronze Age spirituality really knew how to keep your ego on a sensible leash. A fringe idea proposes that the temple complexes were not only religious centers, but lingering nodes of contact with advanced non-human rulers remembered as gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see why it sticks in the imagination. Monumental architecture, mysterious ritual language, divine councils, and a society built around maintaining the favor of beings who are powerful, distant, and occasionally unpredictable. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less a claim of hidden truth and more a lens for asking why the old stories feel so charged. Why do they so often sound as if the cosmos itself is under management and that management has mood swings? The more mainstream answer is that city religion made every daily action part of a larger sacred economy. Labor, taxation, prayer, kingship, and myth all overlapped. Temples express not just belief, but dependence. A careful reading might suggest that when later texts dwell on divine disorder, they are responding to the emotional stakes of that dependence. Humans are trying to keep the channels open. The gods in story after story are not always easy neighbors. And already you can sense the first hairline crack in the grand arrangement. Not a collapse yet, not an empty heaven, just a tension. The city is built as if watched from above. Its storehouses are counted as if order can be guaranteed. Its prayers rise as if someone is meant to hear them. But myths preserved in cuneiform will soon whisper of rivalries, storms, warnings, counsels, punishments, and plans gone awry. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did ancient people think their gods were literally fighting? Probably not in the modern cinematic way later readers imagine. Did they experience the divine world as unstable, at times capable of conflict and retreat? The texts may suggest that they did. So you walk on through the warming streets past baskets of dates and jars of beer, under walls that trap the smell of sun-baked mud toward a city that believes itself held inside a sacred order. Most historians agree that this urban world was real, sophisticated, and deeply organized around divine institutions. One interpretation is that its myths preserve the emotional memory of cosmic strain. And if the evidence is thin for any grand departure story, we'll say so. But what if the first signs of that later legend are already here hidden, not in a dramatic farewell, but in the nervous way a civilization builds itself beneath watchful gods? By mid-morning, the light has turned sharper, and the city no longer looks dreamy at all. It looks exposed. The plastered walls reflect brightness with the generosity of a polished frying pan. The lanes feel narrower. Dust rises around sandals and bare feet. Somewhere nearby, a pot cracks in a kiln with a noise like a small argument ending badly. And this is useful because ancient Mesopotamian religion is full of that same feeling, not constant catastrophe, but the sense that order must be maintained every day, or else something frays. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often describe the world as a place won from disorder rather than permanently insulated against it. The evidence we do have points to a religious imagination deeply concerned with boundaries between freshwater and saltwater, city and wilderness civilization, and chaos, life and death gods and humans. Archaeology suggests that this concern was not just literary decoration. It reflected real dependence on rivers, irrigation labor coordination, seasonal timing, and fragile political stability. If even one piece goes wrong, the whole machine begins making alarming noises. That is why the old stories so often tremble with the possibility of things coming apart. Divine anger can unsettle the land. Human noise can become a cosmic nuisance. Rival wills in heaven can spill down into fields and walls and granaries. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature uses mythic language to explore danger, imbalance, and restoration. One interpretation is that these tales preserve emotional memories of generations who lived close to flood, drought, invasion, and civic collapse. When the world feels breakable, your theology tends to develop a nervous system. You can feel that nervous system in the myths where assembly, decree, and judgment matter so much. Gods gather, decisions are made, destinies are assigned, punishments fall, mercy sometimes intervenes, sometimes not. There is bureaucracy in heaven which is somehow both majestic and extremely on brand for the inventors of administrative tablets. This is not a lazy cosmos drifting along in poetic haze. It is governed, contested, and occasionally stressed. A careful reading might suggest that later readers saw, in this repeated tension, the outline of something more dramatic, a divine order that was not merely stern but unstable, not merely hierarchical but under strain. If gods debate, if plans change, if disasters follow, then perhaps in the imagination of later ages it becomes possible to picture a deeper crisis behind the myths. A war maybe, a rupture, a loss of control. That is interpretation, not a certainty, but it helps explain why modern theories keep circling back to these texts, like moths to lamp smoke. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian myths were not writing modern science fiction in disguise. They were composing religious literature, political theology, ritual memory, and poetic explanation. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The stories are not secret transcripts of hidden technology or newspaper reports from a celestial battlefield, but they do speak in ways that can feel startlingly vivid. Storms become weapons. Decrees become world-shaping acts. Silence becomes ominous. Absence becomes meaningful. The evidence we do have points to a society that imagined cosmic order as powerful, yet never completely beyond disturbance. Historians still argue whether specific myths should be read primarily as reflections of ritual systems, as encoded political allegories, as inherited folklore, or as layered compositions doing all of these things at once. That debate matters because it keeps one text from being forced to carry more certainty than it can bear. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in this case, the evidence for a literal, unwinnable war that made the Anunnaki leave Earth is indeed thin. But the evidence for divine tension, cosmic instability, and troubled relationships between the human and divine realms is much stronger. Picture a citizen hearing one of these stories not in a quiet university lecture room, but in a living temple culture where ritual, kingship, labour, and weather all press together. A failed harvest is not abstract. A breached canal is not abstract. A king's weakness is not abstract. So when a myth tells of disorder threatening the world, listeners may not hear fantasy in the modern sense. They may hear structure under stress. One interpretation is that divine conflict in these stories resonated because ordinary people already knew what fragile systems looked like. They lived inside one. And that brings you to a strange threshold, not yet to departure, no, not even to defeat in any straightforward sense. First comes fraying. First comes the slow awareness that what looks permanent may only be maintained. The walls stand, but they need repair. The canals flow, but they need clearing. The rituals continue, but they need confidence. The gods rule, but the myths keep hinting that rule is not the same as ease. Even heaven apparently has meetings that could have been emails. A fringe idea proposes that references to disorder in cuneiform tradition preserve dim memories of actual conflict among powerful, non-human beings, later remembered as gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does latch onto something genuine in the texts, the repeated insistence that order is neither automatic nor free. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths dramatize the ancient truth that every civilization feels one bad season away from panic, that reading is mainstream enough to stand on solid ground and haunting enough to keep the room dim. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the war, later imagined by modern readers, is really an amplified version of a much older Mesopotamian insight that sovereignty itself is exhausting and maintaining creation is a task full of friction, complaint rivalry, and unforeseen consequence? That possibility does not give you a thrilling alien retreat scene, I know. It gives you something quieter and arguably stranger. A cosmos where power is real but not serene. A sacred order that groans a little when it turns. You pass a wall where old mud brick has dried and cracked in thin branching lines. It looks almost like a tablet surface enlarged to the size of a house. A good reminder that Mesopotamia wrote its anxieties into the same material it used to build. Clay for walls, clay for records, clay for myths, clay for memory. Archaeology suggests that this civilization endured through astonishing continuity and repeated disruption, always repairing, rebuilding, recounting. The evidence we do have points to resilience, but also to a deep familiarity with breakdown. So as the sun climbs and the city becomes louder, hotter, and slightly less poetic than the modern imagination prefers, you begin to see why order in these stories always seems one step away from strain. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth is full of cosmic instability pressing against human life. One interpretation is that later readers mistook this pressure for evidence of a hidden divine war story. And what if in a gentler way they were sensing something real anyway, not a lost battle report, but the old unsettling idea that even the highest order can begin to fray at the edges? The heat settles over the city like a heavy hand, and by afternoon even the shadows seem tired. You slip into the cooler dimness of a temple corridor where mud brick walls hold yesterday's breath and oil lamps leave faint soot above alcoves. It smells of reed mats, old incense, damp clay, and the human determination required to keep a sacred institution functioning in a place where the weather is always one step away from personal insult. Somewhere nearby a scribe mutters while recutting a damaged line which feels comforting in its own way. Civilization, as usual, is being held together by overworked people fixing older mistakes. This is where the names begin to matter more. Enlil, Enki, not as flat characters in a simplified modern myth, but as major divine figures within the rich and shifting traditions of Mesopotamian religion. Most historians agree that Enlil was among the most important gods in Sumerian religion, especially associated with authority, kingship, decree, and the city of Nippur. Enki, known later in Akkadian as Ea, was closely tied to wisdom, fresh watercraft, cleverness, and the deep subterranean waters called the Apsu. What's broadly accepted is that these gods had distinct identities, cult centers and roles that developed over long periods of time. They were not invented yesterday by a conspiracy forum with a dramatic font. Archaeology suggests that city cults mattered deeply to how these divine personalities were understood. Nippur's religious prestige helped elevate Enlil's authority in the Mesopotamian imagination. Eridu, one of the oldest southern cities, carried the old and watery associations of Enki. The evidence we do have points to a world in which theology was never floating free from geography. Gods belonged to places and places helped shape the gods. One interpretation is that stories involving tension between great deities may reflect not just cosmic speculation, but the political and priestly realities of different cities' traditions and historical moments. That is where things become interesting, and also where you need a steady hand. Later readers often turn Enlil and Enki into the tidy leaders of two opposing camps in some grand forgotten war, but the ancient texts are subtler than that. Enlil can be stern, forceful, and associated with judgment and command. Enki is often portrayed as clever, inventive, and more sympathetic to human survival in certain myths. A careful reading might suggest a contrast in style or vision. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian literature simply enjoyed exploring different kinds of divine authority through these figures. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, when you move through the old stories, you can feel the tension. In the Atrahasis tradition, for example, humanity is created in response to divine labor problems, and later human noise irritates the higher gods. Enki often plays the role of the one who finds workarounds, preserves life, or nudges events sideways. Enlil appears more directly associated with the decrees of order and punishment. Most historians agree that these myths belong to a broad Mesopotamian literary tradition concerned with labor hierarchy, divine frustration, and survival. One interpretation is that the contrast between Enlil and Enki reflects differing theological moods, command versus cunning decree versus adaptation authority versus improvisation. Historians still argue whether these contrasts should be treated mainly as literary devices, as reflections of regional cult competition, as evolving theological debate, or as a mix of all three. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It reminds you not to force an elegant hidden narrative onto texts that were copied and reshaped over centuries by many hands. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in terms of a literal war council between alien rulers arguing over whether to abandon Earth, the evidence is very thin indeed. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something softer comes into view. What if later readers were not responding to one direct statement, but to the repeated emotional pattern of divided counsel? In story after story, the gods do not always move as one. Decisions are contested. Mercy interrupts punishment. Plans are made, resisted, revised. This is suggestive, not conclusive. Yet it does create the impression of a divine realm in which consensus can crack. Imagine being a temple singer or scribe in a world where divine harmony is the basis of earthly stability. If the great gods themselves seem divided in the stories you inherit, that division would not feel trivial. It would feel like hearing a faint fracture in the beams above your head. The roof may still stand, the hymns may still be sung, the offerings may still arrive warm and fragrant. But one interpretation is that myth allowed ancient people to think about the unsettling idea that power at the top might not be perfectly aligned. And if that tension grows large enough in later imagination, it can start to resemble strategy factions and celestial deadlock. A fringe idea proposes that Enlil and Enki preserve memory of real rival leaders among non-human beings whose conflict eventually made continued rule on Earth impossible. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains appealing because it organizes scattered divine disagreements into a modern plot shape. Humans love factions. We love team jerseys, ideological camps, and the delicious hope that ancient theology was secretly a very dramatic board meeting. But the more grounded reading is still compelling. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian myths preserve a world in which wisdom and authority are not always the same thing, and where cosmic order may require negotiation rather than simple command. That matters for the later departure idea. If the divine world is imagined as internally strained, then absence, silence, or retreat can later be read not as random, but as the outcome of unresolved conflict. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the later claim that the Anunnaki left Earth after a war they could not win is a dramatic overgrowth from a simpler ancient intuition that rule becomes fragile when its own counselors no longer share one mind? The temple corridor darkens as the sun lowers outside, and the sounds of the city soften into a slower rhythm. Somewhere a jar is set down with care. Somewhere water drips into a basin with the patience of geology. You think of Enlil's wind and decree. You think of Enki's subterranean wisdom and evasive solutions. Most historians agree that these gods were central, powerful, and deeply embedded in real cult life and literary tradition. The evidence we do have points to genuine theological complexity, not a single secret script. Yet one interpretation is that their repeated contrasts gave later ages the raw material for imagining divided counsel before catastrophe. And what if those old stories copied in clay and carried across centuries were never trying to hand you a solved mystery? What if they were preserving something murkier and more humanly recognizable? The discomfort of watching powerful beings disagree while ordinary lives continue beneath them, hoping the roof holds, hoping the river behaves, hoping that people in charge, divine or otherwise, eventually figure it out before everyone else has to pay for the meeting. By evening, the city has changed its personality. The brutal brightness has loosened its grip, and the mud brick walls now hold a softer warmth, as if the whole place has been baked all day and is finally beginning to exhale. Smoke rises in thin blue threads from cooking fires. Bread comes off hot stones. A baby cries somewhere with the commitment of a temple trumpet. Frogs begin their shift out by the canals. And in this gentler hour you can approach one of the strangest recurring themes in Mesopotamian myth, the idea that human beings become in some sense too much. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation and flood traditions form part of a long and influential literary heritage. The Atrahasis story in particular is widely discussed because it links the creation of humans to labor divine dissatisfaction and eventual catastrophe. What's broadly accepted is that in this tradition, humans are made in part to relieve lesser gods of exhausting work. Later, human noise or overabundance becomes a source of divine irritation, and a sequence of punishments follows, culminating in a flood from which one man survives through divine warning. Archaeology suggests that flood traditions in Mesopotamia grew in a region where rivers were life-giving and dangerous at the same time, so the setting already carried all the emotional ingredients for a memorable divine complaint. Now, the famous noise problem is where modern readers often lean forward a little too fast, like someone trying to hear gossip through a wall. In the text, humanity's noise troubles the higher gods, especially Enlil. Most historians agree that this should first be understood within the literary and religious framework of Mesopotamian myth, not as a straightforward historical record of some literal acoustic emergency. A more cautious explanation could be that noise symbolizes human overgrowth disorder, pressure on cosmic balance, or the burden of mortality itself crowding the world. That is mainstream safe ground, and it is solid enough to stand on. But one interpretation is that the irritation in those lines feels unusually personal. Not just abstract disorder, but exhaustion, a sense that the system is straining. The gods are not distant and serene here. They are bothered, frustrated, tired of the consequences of their own arrangements. The evidence we do have points to a mythic world where divine rule is not depicted as effortlessly graceful. It creaks, it complains, it reaches for correction. Bronze Age cosmic management, you begin to suspect, was not running on strong coffee and positive affirmations. Historians still argue whether the noise in Atrahasis should be read mainly as a metaphor for population pressure, as a literary expression of disorder, as a theological statement about human limitation, or as a blend of several ideas at once. That uncertainty matters because it keeps the text from being flattened into a single slogan. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for turning this into proof of alien overlords losing patience with a rebellious species is very thin. Still, the emotional force of the passage is real. The gods seem strained by the very humanity they authorized. That is where later imagination begins to build its scaffolding. A fringe idea proposes that these stories preserve memory of non-human rulers who engineered humanity for labor, then found the result noisy, unstable, or difficult to control. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it takes the old myth at its most vivid and reads it almost literally. Humans are created for work. Humans multiply. Humans become a problem. Powerful beings respond. If you are in the mood for cosmic office drama, it is almost impossible not to see the shape of one. Yet the more cautious reading may be even more unsettling. What if the myth is not about technical failure, but about the moral discomfort of hierarchy itself? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies depended on labor systems, ranked authority, and the extraction of work from many for the benefit of powerful institutions. One interpretation is that myths like Atrahasis reflect those realities in divine form. The gods complain about labor, then humans are created to bear it. Then humans become troublesome in turn. The whole arrangement feels less like a clean solution than a transfer of burden downward, which, to be fair, is a management style with remarkable historical longevity. And so, as lantern light begins flickering in doorways and the evening air cools enough to be forgiven for the daytime, you can sense why this noise problem later feeds bigger theories. If the gods are already irritated, if the system is already unstable, then later readers can imagine that something larger may have been breaking behind the scenes. What if the complaints are not the cause of the crisis, but a symptom of it? What if the story is pointing at something else? That question belongs to interpretation, not conclusion, but it helps explain why the old lines feel heavier than their brevity should allow. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian myths evolved through long scribal traditions with copying adaptation and variation across centuries. The evidence we do have points to literary layering rather than one single author handing down a neat secret. That means even strong patterns must be handled carefully. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When divine frustration appears in these stories, it does not automatically mean there was an original historical event beneath it. It may simply mean that ancient thinkers were very honest about the tension built into existence. Creation is useful, then inconvenient. Order is necessary, then burdensome. Life is precious, then noisy. Anyone who has ever tried to sleep through a neighbour's midnight furniture moving project can sympathise, at least on a very humble scale. Still, the mood matters. Mesopotamian religion often imagines the divine world as capable of irritation, distance, and severe response. That alone is enough to create a foundation for later stories of withdrawal. If gods tire of human clamour, perhaps they step back. If sacred order becomes exhausting to maintain, perhaps closeness fades. One interpretation is that later ideas about the Anunnaki leaving Earth grew from this emotional grammar beings once deeply involved in earthly life, become increasingly remote, not because a tablet states it plainly, but because the literary atmosphere makes it imaginable. A popular rumour claims that flood and creation texts hide a coded memory of a full divine conflict that humans were never meant to understand. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and most historians would not go that far. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the old myth takes on an eerie aftertaste. The complaint about human noise no longer feels like a random annoyance. It feels like strain in a system already nearing its limit. Night settles more firmly now. The temple songs grow slower. Oil lamps halo doorways in gold. The canal water reflects a trembling ribbon of light. Most historians agree that the Atrahasis tradition belongs to a deeply rooted Mesopotamian conversation about labour, divine order, punishment, and survival. One interpretation is that the noise problem represents more than simple volume. It may hint at pressure, crowding disorder, and divine fatigue. And what if that fatigue, remembered and enlarged by later generations, became one of the first shadows in the long story that would one day imagine the Anunnaki, not merely angered, but exhausted enough to leave? Night has fully taken the city now, and with darkness the imagination becomes bolder. Oil lamps burn in niches and doorways, each little flame making a private kingdom out of a patch of mud brick wall. The stars spread above the flat roofs with the kind of confidence only a desert-adjacent sky can manage. From the canal comes the wet chirr of insects. From a nearby courtyard comes the soft slap of dough, a murmur of voices, then laughter that rises and falls like water against reeds. And under all of it, in the stories copied on clay and remembered in ritual, there is a persistent language of power that sounds less like gentle divinity and more like force in motion. Storm, brilliance, decree, radiance. The kind of imagery that makes later readers start connecting dots with a little too much enthusiasm and a little too little sleep. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often describe divine action through vivid natural and symbolic language. Gods appear with terrifying brightness. Their words shake worlds. Their anger brings storm, flood, drought, disease, or upheaval. What's broadly accepted is that these images belong to a religious imagination shaped by weather, kingship, warfare, and ritual awe. Archaeology suggests that in a landscape where dust storms, flooding rivers, scorching light, and thunder could transform life very quickly, it made sense to imagine divine power in similarly overwhelming terms. The evidence we do have points to a culture that understood power not as an abstract principle, but as something you could feel on your skin. That matters because later interpreters often seize on the more spectacular imagery as if it were technical description. a careful reading might suggest otherwise. When hymns speak of gods whose radiance terrifies, whose presence blazes, whose voice thunders, the more cautious explanation could be that we are hearing poetic theology, not engineering notes from a hidden machine room. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is the most responsible starting place. Ancient people were perfectly capable of metaphor without secretly filing patents. Still, the imagery has force. It lingers. In texts from Mesopotamia, divine power is often associated with splendor so intense it overwhelms ordinary perception. Temples themselves help stage that effect. Gleaming metals, polished stone, perfumed oils, colored garments, elevated platforms, ritual movement music, incense. Most historians agree that religion in Mesopotamia used sensory drama to communicate hierarchy and sacred presence. One interpretation is that mythic descriptions of divine radiance and storm magnify that experience into cosmic scale. What you feel in the temple, the text makes universal. What you see in weather, the myth makes personal. Historians still argue whether some of the more dramatic divine imagery should be read primarily as inherited poetic convention, as ritual exaggeration, as theological symbolism, or as encoded reflections of royal ideology. That uncertainty matters because it protects the text from being stripped of its ancient voice and forced to speak modern genre language. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence is thin indeed for taking storm weapon or blazing appearance as proof of advanced technology wielded in a literal war among the Anunnaki. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can understand why the language feels combustible in the modern imagination. Storm gods hurl force, divine decrees fall like blows, sacred brilliance blinds or terrifies. The old stories are not shy about scale. A fringe idea proposes that such imagery preserves dim memory of actual devices or powers later mythologized as the tools of divine combat. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because the poetry is so physical. It makes you see things, hear things, picture the air itself splitting open. If you are the sort of person who sees one unusual cloud and immediately assumes the universe is sending a personal memo, Mesopotamian myth is not going to calm you down. The mainstream reading remains steadier. Most historians agree that divine weapons in ancient literature often symbolize authority, natural force, legitimacy, or the terror of judgment. Archaeology suggests that kingship and warfare shaped the language available to describe ultimate power. If earthly rulers marched with standards, chariots, trumpets, and trained violence, then the gods would naturally be imagined with even greater instruments of command. One interpretation is that the battlefield atmosphere in some myths reflects not an actual divine war remembered like history, but the projection of human political realities onto the cosmos. And yet, as you listen to the old phrases in the dark, it is hard not to feel the tension they carry. These are not sleepy decorative gods. Their splendor is dangerous. Their anger is active. Their presence can be too much for humans to bear. The evidence we do have points to a world where sacred closeness is powerful, but not comfortable. Divinity is not cozy. It can bless, yes, but it can also overpower, destabilize, and terrify. Which is perhaps a useful reminder for anyone who imagines ancient religion as a relaxing hobby involving tasteful candles and soft flute music. This is still Bronze Age theology. The candles are there, but so is existential dread. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if later ideas about an unwinnable war came not from any single line about combat, but from this larger atmosphere of force and splendor? If the gods are repeatedly described as wielding energies that shake creation, then the possibility of conflict among them becomes emotionally plausible, even if the tablets never narrate it in the tidy form modern audiences crave. One interpretation is that later readers stitched together storm imagery, divine rivalry, and eventual sacred distance into a departure narrative because the ingredients were already lying on the table. The temple drummer begins a slow pattern somewhere beyond the courtyard, and the sound rolls through the walls like a heartbeat. Above, the stars remain indifferent. Below, human listeners tell stories large enough to match them. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myth uses weather brilliance and terrifying force to dramatize divine presence. A careful reading might suggest these are symbolic expressions shaped by ritual and environment. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the same language can also feed a more cinematic question. What would it look like if such powers were not merely displayed but turned against one another? That question stays at the edge of the room, not yet answered, just illuminated by lamp smoke and speculation. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the texts speak of divine power in storm-soaked and radiant terms. We know later readers love to literalize what ancient poets knew how to leave suggestive. We know there is no full consensus on how best to interpret every image. And we know that once power is imagined in these dazzling, dangerous ways, it becomes very easy for the mind to picture a battlefield vast enough to make even gods reconsider the wisdom of remaining close to Earth. So you sit with that image a while, not as proof, not as certainty, but as mood. The lamp gutters, the drum goes quiet. Somewhere a dog barks once, then thinks better of it. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian divine imagery is poetic symbolic and shaped by the real textures of weather ritual and rule. One interpretation is that later audiences mistook some of that poetry for literal memory. And what if even so, the old texts were still doing exactly what powerful stories do, best making you feel that the forces governing the world are magnificent, dangerous, and perhaps not always fully in control of themselves? The night wears on, and the city begins to thin into pockets of wakefulness. Some courtyards still glow with lamp fire. Some rooftops hold quiet figures stretched on mats, hoping for a breeze and pretending not to hear the snoring of relatives 3 arm lengths away. Somewhere in the darkness, a gate creaks, then settles. Somewhere a priest is still awake, or a scribe or a woman rocking a child who has decided sleep is an oppressive social construct. Beneath all of that small human persistence lies a larger question, one that matters more than any single mythic image. If the gods are strained, divided, or distant, what happens to kingship on Earth? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian kingship was deeply tied to divine legitimacy. Rulers did not usually claim to govern by mere personal charisma, which is fortunate because history suggests that is rarely enough. They ruled because the gods had granted authority, favoured the city, upheld the throne, or assigned cosmic order through royal office. What's broadly accepted is that royal inscriptions, hymns, building dedications, and legal traditions repeatedly present kingship as dependent on divine sanction. Archaeology suggests that temples and palaces were linked not just physically in some cities, but ideologically. Sacred order and political order stood very close together, sometimes so close they could borrow each other's sandals without asking. That means any instability in the divine realm would not remain safely in heaven. If the gods quarrel, earthly rule becomes nervous. If sacred favour shifts, dynasties wobble. If divine presence feels withdrawn, kings suddenly look much less like sturdy pillars of order and more like men wearing very expensive anxiety. One interpretation is that royal texts, even when triumphant on the surface, often echo fear about instability above and below. Victory inscriptions boast because defeat is imaginable. Temple restorations proclaim renewal because decay is always waiting. The evidence we do have points to a world where political authority was never just administration. It was theatre theology and damage control all at once. You can see this in the way kings build. They rebuild temples, restore walls, dredge canals, dedicate statues, and announce that they have re-established proper relations with the gods. Most historians agree that such works were practical as well as symbolic. A repaired canal feeds people. A restored sanctuary signals order. A strong wall discourages very rude neighbours. But a careful reading might suggest something more emotional beneath the declarations. The king is not simply improving infrastructure, he is trying to reassure everyone that heaven and earth are still on speaking terms. Historians still argue whether the formulaic language of royal inscriptions should be read mainly as propaganda, as genuine theology, as ritual obligation, or as a blend of all three. That debate matters because ancient kings were fully capable of sincerity and self-promotion at the same time. Frankly, they would have done wonderfully on modern social media. Just restored cosmic balance, humbled and honoured, followed by several carefully chosen photographs beside a newly polished temple gate. Still, the anxiety is real. Mesopotamian cities faced warfare, succession crises, trade shifts, crop failure, and environmental pressure. Archaeology suggests that urban fortunes could change dramatically over generations. The evidence we do have points to repeated cycles of rise, disruption, rebuilding, and reinterpretation. In that context, kingship becomes a desperate balancing act. The ruler must present himself as chosen, competent, and able to secure divine favor, even when events suggest the universe has started improvising without consulting him. That is where later departure theories find a useful opening. If the gods appear less stable in myth, and kings seem increasingly burdened with preserving order below a fringe idea, proposes that earthly rulers were effectively left managing the aftermath of a higher retreat. This theory isn't widely accepted, but you can see why it appeals. It turns royal anxiety into a clue. Why all the rebuilding? Why all the emphasis on restoring divine favor? Why the repeated insistence that kingship still descends properly from above? If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the pattern becomes eerie, earthly thrones being steadied while their supposed patrons are already stepping back. The more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian kingship was always precarious, and the language of restoration simply reflects the normal fragility of early states. That is not only safer ground, it is strong ground. Most historians agree that no cuneiform text plainly announces that the Anunnaki abandoned their earthly roles and left humans to govern alone. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do show rulers constantly reasserting divine connection, but that does not automatically imply an actual prior rupture. It may simply mean that all authority requires repetition, especially in a world where disaster can arrive by river spear or bad harvest. Even so, the emotional effect is hard to ignore. Imagine being an ordinary inhabitant of one of these cities. You hear that the king has rebuilt the shrine. You hear that the proper rites have resumed. You hear that the gods again favor the land. And perhaps you want to believe it, because the alternative is deeply inconvenient. If divine backing grows uncertain, everything else becomes negotiable in the worst possible way. Laws become brittle. Borders become porous. Oaths lose some of their shine. One interpretation is that the great effort poured into affirming kingship reflects not total confidence, but the fear of what happens if the bridge between sacred authority and earthly rule starts to sway. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the later legend of the Anunnaki leaving Earth after a war they could not win is not really about dramatic departure at first, but about a transfer of burden? The gods in myth remain powerful, but the work of keeping order feels increasingly human. Kings build, calculate, command, appease and repair. Cities rise, not because heaven is effortlessly present, but because institutions on the ground keep performing stability over and over again. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it casts royal inscriptions in a slightly sadder light. Less triumphant, more like public reassurance written against private dread. A popular rumor claims that ancient kings preserved secret knowledge that the old divine rulers had withdrawn, and that temple rituals became a kind of maintenance routine for an absent regime. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it is far from mainstream acceptance. But it touches a genuine feature of the evidence ritual and rule continue even when the divine world in literature can feel tense, distant, or hard to read. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know kingship depended on sacred legitimacy. We know cities repeatedly had to repair both buildings and belief. We know myths preserved conflict punishment and uneasy divine relationships. Beyond that, the mist thickens. The lamps are fewer now. A dog noses through discarded husks near a wall. The canal has gone black as polished stone. Somewhere far off, a watchman taps wood against wood in patient rhythm. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian kingship stood on divine foundations, however those were interpreted in each age. One interpretation is that royal urgency sometimes echoes a larger anxiety about cosmic instability. And what if, long before anyone imagined the Anunnaki retreating after an unwinnable war, people were already living with the quieter version of that fear that the heavens still mattered, but the labour of holding the world together had been sliding little by little into human hands? The city is quiet enough now that the smallest sounds start to feel ceremonial. A reed door rustles. A clay jar cools with faint ticking sounds. Sand skims along a courtyard edge in a breeze too modest to call itself wind. Above you the stars hold their positions with that ancient, slightly smug steadiness, as if they have never once misplaced a tablet, a king, or an empire. And this is the hour for a difficult truth, the kind that matters precisely because it is less dramatic than rumour would prefer. Most historians agree that no known cuneiform text plainly states in simple direct terms that the Anunnaki left Earth after a war they could not win. That sentence or anything close to it does not appear as a documented line in the mainstream corpus. The evidence we do have points instead to scattered references, divine assemblies, absent favour journeys between realms, underworld roles, disrupted order, abandoned cities, lamentation, and the distance that sometimes opens between gods and humans. One interpretation is that later readers drew these strands together into a departure story because the emotional pattern felt coherent, even if the texts themselves never present it as one tidy event. And that is where honesty becomes part of the atmosphere tonight. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In this case, it is thin for the strongest version of the claim. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The Anunnaki departure story is best understood as a later interpretation built from older Mesopotamian themes, not as a single explicit revelation from a surviving tablet. That does not make it worthless as a story, it just changes what kind of story it is. Less solved mystery, more puzzle assembled from weathered pieces, several of which may belong to entirely different boxes. Still, the puzzle has a shape. You can feel why it formed. Mesopotamian texts sometimes speak of gods withdrawing from cities, neglecting sanctuaries, allowing destruction, or becoming difficult to approach. Royal lamentations and city laments describe sacred order collapsing in ways that feel more intimate than simple political defeat. Most historians agree that these texts are rooted in real historical experiences of warfare, conquest, temple destruction, and civic catastrophe. Archaeology suggests that cities in Mesopotamia repeatedly suffered upheaval, and the literary response often personified that suffering through divine absence or divine decision. What's broadly accepted is that when a city fell, people did not only lose walls and storehouses, they lost confidence that heaven still favoured the place. One interpretation is that this recurring literary theme of absence became, in much later imagination, a literal departure narrative. A god leaves the temple, a patron abandons the city, a divine presence retreats. If enough of these moments accumulate across myths, hymns, and laments, then a reader already inclined toward large hidden patterns may begin to imagine a larger withdrawal altogether. Not one sanctuary, not one city, Earth itself. That is interpretation, not certainty, but it helps explain the emotional logic of the theory. Historians still argue whether divine absence in Mesopotamian literature should be read mainly as theological metaphor, as ritual language for political collapse, as emotional processing of civic trauma, or as evidence of changing religious experience over time. That debate matters because it keeps the old texts alive in their own terms instead of letting modern narrative hunger flatten them into a single cinematic revelation. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient people used divine departure language to describe what catastrophe feels like from inside a sacred civilization. When temples go quiet and kings fail, it is natural to say the gods have left. Natural and devastating. A fringe idea proposes that those laments preserve a literal memory of non-human rulers evacuating or retreating from Earth after an unwinnable conflict. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains traction because it offers something the ancient texts rarely do closure. It explains the silence. It explains the distance. It turns scattered grief into a single cause. Humans love a clean cause, especially when the alternative is that history is messy layered and occasionally indifferent. Also, they lost a cosmic war, and left is undeniably catchier than several literary traditions reflect civic trauma in shifting theological language. One of those gets 1 million clicks, the other gets tenure. But the quieter reading is no less haunting. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real mystery is not that the gods physically departed, but that people repeatedly experience sacred order as fragile and interruptible? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion assumed contact between divine and human realms was real, structured, and necessary. Temples, offerings, hymns, and ritual calendars all depended on that assumption. So when the texts speak as if that contact had weakened, the emotional effect would have been enormous. A careful reading might suggest that later readers sensed this weakening and translated it into a more modern language of abandonment. Picture a temple courtyard after conquest. The gate damaged, the storerooms emptied, the statue removed or hidden, the songs interrupted, lamps extinguished. Archaeology suggests that such scenes did occur in the long and often violent history of Mesopotamian cities. The evidence we do have points to the material reality behind many laments. Now picture those losses entering literature. The city speaks, the goddess grieves, the god has turned away, the sanctuary is forsaken. That is not hidden science fiction, it is the religious poetry of devastation. Yet one interpretation is that across centuries these recurring scenes trained the imagination to think in terms of departure distance and broken connection. A popular rumor claims there are untranslated or suppressed tablets that plainly reveal the full departure of the Anunnaki. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and there is no good mainstream basis for assuming such a cache exists, waiting under a museum staircase beside a suspiciously dramatic torch. What's broadly accepted is far more ordinary and somehow far sadder. The corpus is incomplete, many tablets are broken, and much of ancient literature survives in fragments. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Broken clay invites grand confidence from people who have never had to reconstruct 3 missing lines from 20 crumbs and a prayer. And yet, even from fragments, a mood emerges. Gods can be near, then far. Temples can flourish, then stand silent. Divine order can feel strong, then strangely hard to locate. Most historians agree that this pattern is real in the literature, even if the literal departure theory is not broadly accepted. One interpretation is that later ages merely exaggerated an older truth that Mesopotamian religion already knew what it meant to feel watched, then uncertainly unwatched. So the night deepens around you, and the city seems less like a place than a held breath. The last lamp in a side room burns low. Somewhere a scribe's stylus is set down for good. Most historians agree that no surviving tablet gives us the dramatic sentence modern legend wants. The evidence we do have points instead to absence, rupture, lament, and divine distance scattered across many texts. One interpretation is that these fragments fed a later story of the Anunnaki leaving Earth after a war they could not win. And what if the strongest part of that later story is not its claim of certainty, but the old unease beneath it, the sense that something powerful once felt nearer than it does now, and nobody ever received a neat explanation for why. By the time the night begins leaning toward dawn, the city feels older than it did a few hours ago. The lanes are emptier. The temple walls are cooler. A faint greyness gathers at the edge of the sky, not enough to call morning, yet just enough to remind you that darkness always has an appointment it cannot miss. Somewhere a jar lid shifts in the breeze. Somewhere a sleeping animal exhales with heroic conviction. And all around you are the ruins within the city and the memory of ruins beyond it, because Mesopotamia is never just one place at one moment. It is layers, foundations beneath foundations, a civilization forever standing beside the remains of earlier confidence. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian cities rose, declined, were rebuilt, conquered, restored, and sometimes abandoned across long stretches of time. Archaeology suggests that climate shifts, river changes, warfare, trade, disruptions, political fragmentation, and imperial transformation all played roles in these cycles. What's broadly accepted is that the ruins of temples, palaces, walls, and canals were not abstract curiosities to ancient people. They were visible reminders that order could vanish. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where collapse was not just remembered in stories. It could be walked over in your sandals. That matters because silence has a different weight when you know what once filled it. A working temple rings with song labour smoke, water, footsteps, and calculation. An abandoned one keeps only dust wind and the occasional bird who seems far too cheerful given the setting. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian literature's recurring sense of divine distance was sharpened by the physical reality of ruined sacred spaces. If a sanctuary falls quiet, the easiest language for that experience is not economic decline or hydrological stress. It is that the god has left. Most historians agree that city laments and related texts present destruction in deeply theological terms. Gods abandon shrines. Patron deities turn away. Sacred protection lifts. The city mourns like a person. A careful reading might suggest that this language reflects the emotional truth of collapse more than a literal account of divine movement. That is mainstream safe and frankly powerful enough already. When the center of your world stops functioning, it really does feel as if something larger has withdrawn its presence. You do not need secret spacecraft under the ziggurat. You need the unbearable quiet of a place built for contact that no longer receives an answer. Historians still argue whether the abandonment language in these texts is primarily ritual poetic convention, historical theology shaped by conquest civic trauma, expressed through myth or some mixture of all three. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It prevents us from turning a rich body of lament into a simplistic code. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And again, the evidence is thin for reading ruined cities as proof that the Anunnaki literally evacuated Earth after a losing war. Still, a fringe idea proposes exactly that the silence of ruined Mesopotamian centers marks more than local disaster and instead preserves memory of a much wider withdrawal. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is emotionally intuitive. If multiple cities fall, if sacred order seems interrupted, if gods once treated as active patrons now feel remote, then the imagination reaches for one larger explanation. They left. Not merely this temple, not merely this dynasty. Earth. It is a grand leap, yes, but one fed by real ingredients, ruined silence, interrupted ritual, and the persistent human suspicion that absence must have a story. The more cautious explanation could be that ruins create theological pressure. You stand before broken walls and ask what happened to the relationship they once housed. That question does not belong only to Mesopotamia. It belongs to every civilization with old sacred architecture and a talent for grief. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the later departure myth is less a preserved memory than a retrospective answer to a physical sensation? The eerie mismatch between what these monumental places were built for and what they later became. Imagine walking into a temple courtyard after years of neglect. The plaster is flaking. Reed mats are gone. Offerings no longer arrive. Storage rooms hold only debris. The basin is dry. The steps once worn by priests and petitioners collect dust instead. Archaeology suggests that such scenes were historically real in many places and periods. The evidence we do have points to the ordinary brutality of political change and environmental stress. Yet one interpretation is that once sacred silence becomes common enough in literature and memory, it starts to feel like a pattern bigger than history, a pattern of retreat. A popular rumor claims that ancient Mesopotamians quietly understood their gods had abandoned them and that official religion became a sort of ceremonial echo after the fact. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and most historians would not frame it that way. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion remained active, adaptive, and institutionally resilient across very long periods. Gods were not simply gone in any clean sense. Worship continued, temples were restored, ritual systems persisted. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The literary language of absence does not mean the civilization believed itself permanently cut off across the board. It means experiences of rupture were real and profound enough to enter the sacred imagination again and again. That nuance matters because without it, you get the false drama of total disappearance. The actual picture is subtler. Presence and absence alternate. Some shrines thrive while others decline. Some eras restore confidence while others crack it. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious life was dynamic rather than uniformly fading. One interpretation is that later readers compressed this long, uneven history into a single, cleaner tale of departure, because modern minds often prefer one dramatic event over centuries of mixed evidence. We are regrettably very impatient with nuance. Nuance does not come with thunderclaps. And yet the silence of ruins still does its work on you. Dawn is closer now. The sky has gone from charcoal to ash. A bird calls once from somewhere high on a damaged wall. In this half-light, a broken platform or collapsed shrine can look less like architecture than like a question left unfinished. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know cities fell, we know temples went quiet, we know literature gave those losses divine language. We do not know that the Anunnaki departure theory is historically true in the literal sense, but we do know why it feels persuasive to people standing amid old silence. Most historians agree that ruins in Mesopotamia are products of ordinary historical pressures, however dramatic their literary afterlife became. Archaeology suggests no single vanished golden order, so much as repeated cycles of damage and rebuilding. One interpretation is that later stories of divine retreat magnified the emotional truth of those cycles into a myth of global abandonment. And what if that myth, for all its uncertainty, is really trying to say something simpler and older, that when sacred places fall quiet, humans almost always imagine not just that something ended there, but that something chose to leave. A pale line of dawn now rests along the horizon, and the city seems to hesitate before committing to morning. Roof lines sharpen. The tops of temple walls catch the first weak light. The canal is no longer black, but dull silver like a blade left overnight in the damp. Someone nearby begins sweeping a threshold with slow, repetitive strokes, and the sound feels strangely important, as if the world is being persuaded back into order one bristle at a time. That small gesture matters because so much of Mesopotamian religion rests on the idea that connection between heaven and earth is not automatic. It has to be maintained. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religious life assumed ongoing exchange between divine and human realms through ritual. Offerings were made, hymns were sung, calendars were observed, temples were tended, sacred images were washed, clothed, fed, and honored. What's broadly accepted is that these practices were not symbolic in some casual modern sense. They were acts of relationship. Archaeology suggests that temple systems were carefully organized to support this constant traffic of care, labor, and reverence. The evidence we do have points to a world where heaven and earth were thought to touch through institutions, routines, and repeated acts of attention. That is why broken connection hurts so much in the literature. If the divine realm is expected to respond bless or remain accessible, then silence becomes meaningful very quickly. A careful reading might suggest that many Mesopotamian texts are haunted less by atheistic doubt than by interrupted exchange. The gods still exist. The cosmic framework still matters. But the signal seems weaker. The road between realms feels less reliable. One interpretation is that later readers transformed this recurring mood into a more literal image. The ladders between heaven and earth may still stand, but no one is climbing them anymore. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cosmology imagined a layered universe in which heaven, earth, the underworld, and deep waters were related but distinct. Divine beings moved across these boundaries in myth, ritual, imagination, and sacred language. The Anunnaki themselves, depending on the text, can appear associated with high divine assembly or with underworld judgment. Historians still argue whether these shifting roles reflect theological development, local variation, or broader literary flexibility. That uncertainty matters because it reminds you that no one fixed map of the divine world covers every text neatly. Ancient religion is not a train schedule. It is closer to a long family argument carried across centuries. Still, the idea of connection matters enough that its weakening becomes dramatic. When a temple image is absent, when ritual stops, when laments describe gods departing from a city, what is really at stake is not only presence but access. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion depended on mediating structures, sanctuaries, priests, offerings, festivals, divine favor, royal support. Remove enough of those, and even if the gods remain conceptually real, they become socially distant. A more cautious explanation could be that later myths of total departure grow from this practical and emotional experience of interrupted mediation. The divine world has not vanished exactly, it has become harder to reach. This is where the later Anunnaki departure theory gains some of its most haunting energy. A fringe idea proposes that humanity once lived in more direct contact with powerful non-human rulers, and that after conflict or failure, those rulers withdrew beyond ordinary access, leaving rituals behind as echoes of an older relationship. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows its emotional strength from something genuine in the evidence ancient people invested enormous labor in maintaining a connection that they clearly feared could weaken. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the theory becomes less about hidden certainty and more about exaggerated sacred homesickness. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated concern with access mediation and divine response tells you that Mesopotamian people already experienced the sacred as near but not secure? Most historians agree that rituals were meant to sustain cosmic order, not just symbolize it. The evidence we do have points to extraordinary care in sacred maintenance because the stakes were thought to be real. One interpretation is that when later readers imagine the Anunnaki leaving Earth, they are dramatizing a quieter ancient truth, that closeness to the divine always required work, and sometimes that work no longer seemed to bridge the gap. Dawn brightens. A porter lifts a basket onto his shoulder. A woman pours water from one jar into another, the splash briefly loud in the still air. Smoke begins again from breakfast fires. You are watching connection rebuilt for another day in the most ordinary ways possible, and perhaps that is why grand myths often rest on such humble ground. Temple life depends on grain oil, textiles, timing, labor, memory, and clean floors. Heaven may be lofty, but it still requires somebody to sweep the courtyard. There is a lesson in that, and possibly also a warning for anyone who believes transcendence excuses poor management. A popular rumor claims that the ancients possessed a literal gateway system between worlds later shut down when the gods retreated. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and most historians would place it firmly in the realm of speculative modern storytelling. Yet a careful reading might suggest why the rumor persists. Mesopotamian religion is full of thresholds, doors, stairways, ascents, descents, sacred spaces, and carefully regulated movement between levels of reality. The imagery is architectural because the religion itself is architectural. Access is designed, supervised, and never casual. If the evidence is thin for an actual cosmic gate, we'll say so, but the symbolic language of controlled passage is absolutely there. Historians still argue whether certain images of ascent, descent, or divine travel should be read mainly through ritual mythic geography or poetic convention. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of the fascination. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the texts imagine connected realms. We know ritual was meant to hold that connection open. We know loss or interruption of that bond was deeply painful. We do not know that any one tablet describes the heavens shutting their doors after a failed war. But one interpretation is that later ages heard the old grief of interrupted contact and retold it as a final departure. Now the sun edges above the plain and the first direct light touches the upper brickwork of the temple. For a moment, it looks almost renewed, almost untouched by every fear you have followed through the night. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion depended on an active relationship between divine and human spheres. Archaeology suggests that enormous institutional effort went into sustaining that relationship through ritual and care. One interpretation is that later stories of the Anunnaki leaving Earth magnify older experiences of sacred distance into a larger myth of broken connection. And what if that myth, beneath all its later drama, is simply the oldest human ache of all the feeling that the door is still there, the stairs are still there, the offerings are still there, but the answer from the other side has grown faint. The sun is up now, but the city has not become less mysterious for being visible. In some ways, it is the opposite. Daylight reveals the patched walls, the repaired steps, the water stains, the uneven brickwork, where one generation fixed what another had watched fail. A man leads 2 donkeys through a lane still cool in the shade. A baker fans his oven with the expression of someone negotiating personally with the concept of fire. Temple workers move with practiced purpose, carrying jars, bundles and baskets, as if the universe can in fact be stabilized by good logistics. And perhaps in Mesopotamia that was never entirely a joke. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths include episodes in which gods withdraw, become inaccessible, descend to other realms, hide themselves, or otherwise create distance from humanity. What's broadly accepted is that divine remoteness is a recurring theme, though it appears in many forms and not always with the same meaning. Archaeology suggests that changes in temple maintenance, political patronage, regional power, and historical disruption all shaped how sacred presence was imagined in practice. The evidence we do have points to a religious world where nearness and distance were not permanent conditions. They fluctuated. That fluctuation matters. It is the emotional hinge on which many later theories turn. If a god is near, rituals make sense. If a god is remote, rituals become a plea. If a god has turned away, rituals can begin to resemble maintenance performed in hope rather than confidence. One interpretation is that later stories of the Anunnaki retreating from Earth grew out of this recurring experience of sacred recession. Not disappearance in the absolute sense, but distance. Not a slammed door perhaps, but a door opening less often than it once seemed to. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion was fully capable of holding paradox. Gods could be present and distant, protective and dangerous, deeply involved and yet hard to understand. That is one reason simplistic modern retellings often feel unsatisfying to scholars. The ancient material is less like a solved puzzle and more like a river with many channels. A careful reading might suggest that divine withdrawal in some myths reflects changing religious experience rather than literal movement through space. A more cautious explanation could be that as societies endured crisis, conquest and rebuilding, they increasingly imagined the gods as less immediately available because the world itself felt less stable. Historians still argue whether the motif of divine distance should be read mainly as theological maturity, as trauma response, as political literary symbolism, or as the result of long textual layering. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is important. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In terms of a clear historical event in which the Anunnaki physically retreated because they had no winning option left, the evidence is thin. But in terms of a wider pattern of sacred remoteness, the evidence is far stronger. You can sense that difference if you imagine the ordinary believer. Yesterday or generations ago, the gods seemed close enough to feed, clothe and praise in daily routines. Now perhaps after conquest, drought, dynastic collapse or temple interruption, the same rituals continue but with an edge of longing. The song is sung to a silence that feels thicker. The offering is placed before an image whose power is still acknowledged but whose answer is less obvious. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that did not casually abandon divine life. It persisted, adjusted, rebuilt. Which means that when texts suggest distance, the experience behind them may have been profound indeed. A fringe idea proposes that these moments preserve memory of literal rulers, withdrawing their direct presence while leaving behind institutions to manage human society in their absence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains power from the way Mesopotamian religion already thinks in terms of mediated contact. Priest temples, kings, statues, festivals, decrees. If direct access fades, the structure remains. That is the eerie part. The city still functions, the rituals still happen, the courtyards are swept, bread is still baked for offerings, and yet one interpretation is that the center of gravity has shifted. The system continues, but with more echo in it. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if retreat is less about beings climbing into the sky and more about sacred distance becoming the new normal? That possibility is quieter, but perhaps more faithful to the texture of the texts. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian people did not frame every disruption as final cosmic abandonment. Temples were restored, patron gods could be ritually reinstalled, divine favor could return. The evidence we do have points to repeated renewal as well as rupture. So any theory of total permanent departure has to be handled gently, because the sources themselves keep reopening the connection. And yet retreat remains a useful word if carefully handled. It captures the sense of power stepping back without ceasing to exist. A more cautious explanation could be that myths of withdrawal encode not defeat but altered proximity. The gods remain beyond, above, below, or around, but less available to ordinary civic life. That reading sits comfortably within mainstream evidence. It also happens to resemble in softened form the modern Anunnaki legend. Not because the legend is thereby proven, far from it, but because legends often grow by taking emotional truths and making them concrete. A popular rumor claims the old rituals became outdated because the gods had already gone for good, leaving only ceremonial leftovers. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it goes too far. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religious systems remained adaptive and meaningful for long periods, precisely because people did not experience them as empty leftovers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The ancient evidence supports fluctuations in divine accessibility, not a neatly documented mass theological realization that the heavens had packed their bags and cancelled the lease. Still, the feeling of stepping back lingers. You see it in repaired sanctuaries, in hymns that ask for return, in laments that mourn absence, in royal claims to have restored favour. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the divine world in Mesopotamian literature is not always stably present. We know remoteness, silence, and interrupted contact are recurring realities of the tradition. We do not know that this equals a literal retreat after an unwinnable war. But one interpretation is that later readers, feeling the sadness in these materials, imagined a more dramatic cause, because sadness without explanation is almost unbearable. By now the city is fully awake. Pots ring, water splashes, voices rise in trade instruction, irritation, prayer. A goat steals something and pretends innocence with unbelievable confidence. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths and rituals preserve a world where divine presence could feel real, then fragile, then partially restored. Archaeology suggests that religious life endured through cycles of interruption and repair. One interpretation is that later stories of the Anunnaki withdrawing from Earth magnify these ancient experiences of sacred distance into a larger tale of retreat. And what if the oldest version of that tale is not about escape at all, but about the ache of continuing to live, work, sweep, count and pray after the nearness you once trusted has grown strangely hard to feel? The morning grows brighter and the city begins doing what cities do best, which is carrying on while everyone pretends this is perfectly normal. Merchants open stalls. A potter checks the cooling curve of his latest batch with the same face modern people use when refreshing a tracking page for a package that absolutely should have arrived yesterday. Water carriers weave through the lanes. Priests move in and out of temple spaces with the deliberate focus of people entrusted with keeping the world from becoming embarrassingly unstable. And somewhere in the background of it all lingers the question you have been circling for hours now. If later readers imagined the Anunnaki leaving Earth after a war they could not win, what kind of war are they really imagining? Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths often present conflict as costly, disruptive, and never entirely tidy, even among divine powers. What's broadly accepted is that struggle in these texts usually serves theological and cosmic purposes, rather than functioning as a literal historical chronicle. gods contend over order, judgment, punishment, authority, boundaries, and destiny, archaeology suggests that the societies producing these myths were familiar with real warfare, siege, political collapse, and the grim uncertainty of survival, so divine conflict naturally carried the emotional weight of earthly experience. The evidence we do have points to a culture that did not idealize conflict as clean heroics. Even victory tends to leave dust in the mouth. That matters because the phrase "a war they could not win" is more modern than Mesopotamian, but it does resonate with something older. One interpretation is that later readers took the recurring theme of divine strain and extended it into the language of stalemate. Not total annihilation, not a glorious triumph, a limit, a boundary, a situation in which power discovers that it cannot solve everything by simply being more forceful. If that sounds suspiciously relevant to all of human history as well, that is because ancient myth often understands something empires learn only after sending far too many men and supplies into a bad idea. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion did not usually portray the gods as weak in any simple sense. They remain immensely powerful. Yet a careful reading might suggest that power in these stories is not the same as ease. Floods have consequences. Punishments require intervention. Mercy complicates decrees. Wisdom undercuts wrath. Order must be restored again and again. A more cautious explanation could be that later storytellers misread this ongoing divine labor as evidence of failure, when in fact the myths are dramatizing the cost of maintaining creation. Still, the idea of an unwinnable conflict has a certain eerie logic when you place it beside the tensions already present in the texts. Suppose the war is not one explicit battle scene hidden in broken tablets, but a broader conflict between goals that cannot all be satisfied at once. Order versus freedom, authority versus adaptability, judgment versus survival, distance versus involvement, Enlil-like decree against Enki-like workaround. If you want to sketch it in the simplest possible form without pretending the ancient evidence is that neat. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it makes the later legend easier to understand. The conflict may have seemed unwinnable because the system itself produced contradictions no ruling power could resolve cleanly. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian divine conflict is best read as symbolic theology, political reflection, ritual drama, literary inheritance, or some blend of all of these. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence is thin for turning these tensions into a literal military defeat that forced the Anunnaki to abandon Earth like disappointed landlords. But the evidence is much stronger for a world in which even divine governance is pictured as burdened by impossible balances. You can feel that in the old problem of humanity itself. Humans are made useful, then troublesome. Cities are necessary, then noisy. Kingship is stabilizing, then fragile. Temples connect heaven and earth, then become the very places where absence feels most painful. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature repeatedly returns to this pattern of necessity becoming burden. One interpretation is that the later war legend grows from that pattern. The enemy is not always another god with a better spear. It may be consequence. Time, multiplication, disorder. The sheer exhausting fact that once a complex world is made, it resists being neatly controlled. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki faced actual resistance from forces on Earth or among rival divine factions and withdrew when victory became impossible. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals because it converts tension into plot. It gives you a beginning, middle, and end. Powerful beings arrive. They attempt rule. Opposition rises. They realize the cost is too high. They leave. It is very satisfying in the way legends often are, and suspiciously satisfying in the way scholarship often is not. Real ancient evidence has a much ruder habit of remaining incomplete. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the unwinnable war is simply the human condition seen from above? That possibility sounds grand, but it is built from very old material. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian civilization was brilliant, labor-intensive, vulnerable, and endlessly engaged in maintenance. The evidence we do have points to people living inside systems that needed constant adjustment and never reached perfect stability. One interpretation is that myth projected that same truth onto the divine realm. Even the gods do not get a final, effortless victory over disorder. They manage it, they postpone it, they redistribute it, they survive it, but they do not abolish it. That reading makes later departure myths less like hidden reportage and more like philosophical exaggeration. If divine rule is exhausting enough, then stepping back starts to look almost inevitable, not because the gods are defeated in a comic book sense, but because closeness itself becomes costly. A more cautious explanation could be that stories of retreat grow naturally from stories of burden. If the gods are repeatedly drawn into conflict, punishment, rescue, judgment, and repair, then later ages may imagine them eventually choosing sacred distance over endless entanglement. A popular rumor claims that somewhere in the untranslated margins of Mesopotamian literature lies the final missing account of this lost war. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and there is no mainstream basis for assuming the smoking stylus is sitting in a museum drawer waiting to vindicate your favorite dramatic thumbnail. What's broadly accepted is that surviving texts already show something subtler and more durable power under strain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know divine conflict exists in the literature. We know order is costly. We know no stable final solution appears. We do not know that this equals an actual unwinnable war. But one interpretation is that later readers saw the pattern and gave it the plainest name they could. The streets are noisy now, bright with day, full of trade and dust and routine. A child runs past carrying a basket almost as large as his torso, which feels unfair but historically plausible. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths frame conflict as ongoing, serious, and woven into cosmic order itself. Archaeology suggests that the people telling these stories knew exactly how expensive stability could be. One interpretation is that the later legend of the Anunnaki leaving Earth after a war they could not win magnifies this ancient sense of burden into a final retreat. And what if the oldest truth behind that legend is not that the gods lost a battle, but that even gods in the stories humans tell can reach the edge of what ruling a difficult world is worth? By late morning, the city has settled into its full daily rhythm, and the miracle of it is that anyone ever thought history would be simple. The streets are busy now with barter complaint calculation and the endless traffic of jars, baskets, sandals and animals who seem personally offended by being asked to participate in civilization. Sunlight catches on plaster and straw. A scribe pauses in a doorway to blow dust from a tablet. Somewhere a builder taps a brick into place with gentle insistence, as if reminding the wall that collapse is tacky and should please wait. And into this very ordinary, very human scene steps a much later force that matters almost as much as the ancient texts themselves retelling. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths did not remain frozen in time. They were copied, reworked, translated, adapted, reframed, and reimagined across centuries. Later Mesopotamian cultures inherited earlier Sumerian material. Akkadian compositions reinterpreted older themes, and still later readers in the modern world brought entirely new assumptions to the surviving texts. What's broadly accepted is that ancient literature lives by being recopied, and every act of copying invites at least some degree of change. Archaeology suggests that the tablets we possess are only a fraction of what once existed, and even that fraction often survives in damaged, partial, or context-dependent form. The evidence we do have points to a very old truth stories do not pass through time unchanged. They accumulate fingerprints. That matters because the modern Anunnaki departure idea is itself part of that long afterlife. One interpretation is that it tells you as much about later readers as it does about ancient Mesopotamia. Every age approaches old clay with its own cravings. The ancients wanted order, survival, legitimacy, ritual, continuity. Medieval readers wanted moral pattern. Modern readers often want revelations, secret knowledge, hidden systems, suppressed history, and preferably something that makes ordinary textbooks seem boring by comparison. You can hardly blame them. Complicated theological layering across centuries does not exactly roar off the shelf like a thunder god in a cape. Most historians agree that modern fascination with the Anunnaki owes a great deal to speculative reinterpretation far removed from mainstream Assyriology. A fringe idea proposes that cuneiform texts secretly preserve the story of advanced non-human beings, their internal conflicts, and their final withdrawal from Earth. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has spread because it offers a single dramatic framework into which many scattered motifs can be fitted. Divine councils, flood stories, heavenly descent, sacred kingship, ruined cities, absent gods. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a fascinating case study in how modern myth-making works. We inherit fragments and then rush to complete them in the shape our own age finds most irresistible. Historians still argue whether modern reuses of Mesopotamian material should be treated as harmless, imaginative myth-making, as distortion of ancient cultures, as evidence of genuine public fascination with the ancient world, or as some uncomfortable blend of all three. That debate matters because the old stories deserve both wonder and care. A careful reading might suggest that later retellings are not wrong merely because they are imaginative. They become misleading only when imagination stops labeling itself and begins dressing as certainty. That is why tonight's path has tried to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Most historians agree that the ancient texts do describe divine conflict, sacred distance, cosmic labor, ruined cities, and unstable relationships between heaven and earth. One interpretation is that later ages naturally stitch these together into a more coherent departure legend. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real drama lies not in one lost ancient truth, but in watching every era build its own heaven out of the same broken bricks? You can see this process already within Mesopotamia itself. Sumerian traditions did not simply vanish. They were absorbed, adapted, and given new life in Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian contexts. Divine names shifted in emphasis, local priorities changed, literary forms evolved. The evidence we do have points to continuity without sameness. Ancient people were already retelling their own past long before modern theorists arrived with documentaries, thumbnails, and a suspicious number of dramatic voiceovers. Human beings, it turns out, have always enjoyed re-editing inherited mystery. And yet, there is something touching about the later departure legend even where it overreaches. It senses correctly that the old texts are haunted by absence. It notices that order feels strained, that contact weakens, that divine power in Mesopotamian literature is not always stable or serene. A more cautious explanation could be that modern mythmakers simply turned atmosphere into narrative. They took the ache of the tablets and gave it a plot. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it makes sense of how scattered evidence becomes one memorable claim. A popular rumor claims that scholars ignore or suppress the most dramatic meanings of the tablets because the implications would be too disruptive. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it usually tells you more about modern distrust than about ancient evidence. What's broadly accepted is that Assyriology is difficult, technical, cautious work involving damaged texts, variant readings, uncertain contexts, and the deeply unglamorous labour of philology. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And scholars often say exactly that which is not suppression. It is discipline. Admittedly less exciting than a global cover-up, but much more useful if you want to know what a broken sign on a tablet probably means. Still later, retellings do perform an important function. They keep the questions alive. They remind modern audiences that ancient Mesopotamia was strange, brilliant, and not reducible to dry dates on a classroom wall. The risk is only when wonder outruns care. Most historians agree that the best reading of these materials holds both things together: respect for the documented world and openness to the imaginative pull of what remains uncertain. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki departure story survives because it occupies that borderland perfectly. It offers enough old clay to feel ancient and enough unanswered space to invite projection. The city around you gives a quieter lesson. Here are real walls, real storehouses, real streets built by hands that never imagined 21st century debates about hidden celestial wars. Here is a civilization busy with grain taxes, prayers, repairs, births, burials, and weather. Archaeology suggests that the greatness of Mesopotamia lies not in anyone's secret, but in the astonishing endurance of its institutions, writings, and symbols. The evidence we do have points to a people already living with ambiguity, already preserving myths full of unresolved tension. In that sense, modern retellings are not alien to the tradition, they are simply another layer. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know later ages retold the old material. We know modern readers brought new desires to ancient texts. We know the Anunnaki legend, as commonly framed today, is not broadly accepted as literal history. But one interpretation is that its persistence reveals something very old and very human. We cannot bear fragments without trying to turn them into endings. So the sun climbs higher, the city works on, and the dust of one age continues settling on the stories of another. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths reached us through long chains of copying, reinterpretation, and survival by accident. One interpretation is that the modern tale of the Anunnaki leaving Earth after an unwinnable war is less an ancient confession than a contemporary remake built from authentic old tensions. And what if that too belongs to the history of these texts, not because it solves them, but because every generation faced with broken clay and incomplete memory cannot resist the urge to finish the sentence for itself. By noon, the light is almost ruthless again, and the city looks stripped to essentials. There is no mystery in a sun this bright only exposure. Mud brick shows its cracks, plaster reveals its patchwork. Workers squint beneath loads of reeds and jars. Even the temple platform seems less like an abstract monument and more like something built by people who understood very well that if they stopped maintaining it, the wind would begin negotiating a hostile takeover immediately. And this is the right hour to do the careful work that every mystery resists, separating clay from cosmic mist. Most historians agree that cuneiform texts preserve a mixture of religion, politics, poetry, law, ritual memory, and literary imagination. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian sources do not divide themselves into modern categories for our convenience. A hymn may carry theology, civic pride, and political messaging all at once. A lament may preserve historical trauma through sacred metaphor. A myth may explain the world while also reflecting social structures and regional cult priorities. Archaeology suggests that if you want to understand these tablets responsibly, you must let them be many things at once. The evidence we do have points to complexity, not a hidden master key. That is why the Anunnaki departure theory needs both sympathy and restraint. Sympathy because it is responding to real tensions in the texts, divine conflicts, sacred distance interrupted, contact, ruined cities, frustrated order, and repeated hints that closeness between heaven and earth is neither simple nor permanent. Restraint because those same tensions do not add up automatically to one literal historical conclusion. A careful reading might suggest that later readers saw a pattern and gave it a dramatic shape. A more cautious explanation could be that the pattern was always literary, theological, and emotional before it ever became cinematic. Most historians agree that the documented ground is solid in some places and very thin in others. Solid ground includes the reality of Mesopotamian cities, temple economies, cult images, royal inscriptions, creation myths, flood traditions, laments, divine assemblies, and the shifting roles of major gods such as Enlil and Enki. Solid ground also includes the fact that the Anunnaki appear in ancient texts, though not in a single unified role that would satisfy modern curiosity. Archaeology suggests that these traditions developed across long spans of time and across different cities and empires. The evidence we do have points to continuity with variation, which is the scholarly way of saying ancient religion was not a tidy filing cabinet. Then there is the interpreted ground. One interpretation is that divine disagreement in the texts reflects theological debate shaped by local cult traditions. One interpretation is that divine withdrawal language reflects the emotional reality of conquest and civic collapse. One interpretation is that later ideas of retreat or departure grow from repeated experiences of sacred distance. These are reasonable readings, as long as they stay labelled as readings. Historians still argue whether specific passages lean more toward ritual convention, poetic metaphor, political theology, or inherited mythic patterning. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is not a flaw. It is part of the honest shape of the evidence. Then beyond that comes the mist. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal non-human rulers who departed Earth after a war they could not win. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it compresses many old anxieties into one memorable narrative. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes an imaginative overlay rather than a proven revelation. That matters. Because once imagination forgets to introduce itself, it starts borrowing authority from archaeology without paying rent. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the strongest value of the departure theory is not factual certainty, but the way it dramatizes the ancient experience of unstable nearness? The gods in Mesopotamian literature can be present, absent, angry, merciful, divided, radiant, hidden, and strangely difficult to predict. Most historians agree that this emotional range is real in the sources. One interpretation is that later readers converted that range into a single myth of withdrawal because human beings prefer a decisive ending to a lingering ambiguity. They left after losing a war is neat. The relationship between divine and human realms became increasingly strained across layered literary traditions is true enough to be useful and untidy enough to be ignored at parties. The city around you offers a more grounded lesson. Look at the tools. Look at the baskets, the bricks, the grain jars, the water carriers, the scribes bent over tablets, the priests reciting words they did not invent but still trust enough to speak. Mesopotamian civilization was built from ordinary repetition, measure, record, repair, offer, rebuild, remember. Archaeology suggests that this world did not depend on hidden spectacle so much as relentless maintenance. The evidence we do have points to human labor as the real miracle. One interpretation is that the myths surrounding divine order took shape precisely because human beings were so familiar with how much effort order requires. A popular rumor claims that if you read the tablets the right way, the secret history becomes obvious. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it oversells both the texts and the reader. The tablets are difficult, they are broken, they belong to different eras and genres. Even specialists disagree on translation details, contextual emphasis, and interpretive weight. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And in many places it is thin, which is why intellectual humility is not an accessory here. It is basic equipment, right beside the water jar and the spare stylus. Most historians agree that the best way to honor the ancient material is not to flatten it into either total skepticism or total revelation. Too much skepticism drains the wonder. Too much revelation drains the truth. A careful reading might suggest that the richest approach is layered documented, where the sources are firm interpretive, where the patterns are suggestive, imaginative, where the gaps invite mood rather than conclusion. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the tablets preserve divine conflict and sacred distance. We know cities fell and were mourned in theological language. We know later readers shaped these fragments into larger stories of retreat. We do not know that any surviving cuneiform text directly reveals the Anunnaki leaving Earth after an unwinnable war. But one interpretation is that the legend survives because it gives dramatic form to a subtler ancient truth. Powerful beings in these stories are never entirely at ease in the world they govern. Now the noon light pours over everything without mercy, and the city seems to ask for honesty in return. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian sources offer enduring questions rather than final answers. Archaeology suggests that their greatness lies partly in their refusal to be reduced to one modern storyline. One interpretation is that separating clay from cosmic mist does not weaken the mystery at all, it clarifies it. And what if clarity in the end is more haunting than certainty, not because it tells you exactly what happened, but because it shows how much ancient people already understood about distance instability and the uncomfortable effort of keeping a fragile world from coming apart. The day has reached that still suspended hour when even a busy city seems to soften around its edges. Heat drifts above the courtyards. The reeds by the canal barely stir. Somewhere a potter has stopped tapping for a moment. Somewhere a priest has finished a prayer and not yet begun the next one. The air holds the aftertaste of bread dust, warm clay and river water, and you feel more than ever that Mesopotamia is a place built not on final answers, but on endurance, on repeating what must be repeated, on tending what must be tended, on living beside mysteries without demanding that every one of them explain itself before sunset. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilization left behind temples, tablets, myths, and questions rather than one single final message about the gods and their intentions. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong to a real ancient religious tradition. Yet the modern story that cuneiform texts reveal they left Earth after a war they could not win is a much later interpretation, not a plain statement from the surviving corpus. Archaeology suggests that the old texts give us divine conflict, sacred distance, ruined cities, interrupted order, and a world in which heaven and earth do not always remain comfortably aligned. The evidence we do have points to atmosphere tension and fragments, not to one complete lost confession. And still, the legend persists. One interpretation is that it persists because it feels emotionally true, even where it is not securely documented in the literal way some modern retellings prefer. The old stories do seem haunted by strain. Gods disagree. Order must be repaired. Cities lose favor. Temples fall silent. Human beings keep working anyway. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the later departure myth survives because it gives a dramatic outline to an ancient feeling that already lived in the clay, that the powers above were never entirely settled, never entirely close forever, never entirely free from burden? Most historians agree that no surviving tablet gives us the neat modern line everyone secretly wants. There is no single preserved scene in which the Anunnaki gather, admit defeat, and depart Earth with cinematic resignation. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. In that strongest form, it is thin. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The departure story is best treated as a debated interpretation built from older Mesopotamian themes rather than as settled historical fact. Historians still argue whether the deeper meaning of divine withdrawal language lies mostly in theology politics, ritual emotion, civic trauma, or some blend that cannot be untangled cleanly. That uncertainty matters because it protects the real texture of the ancient world from being polished into something too smooth. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal rulers who found Earth impossible to govern and retreated when conflict or burden became too great. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a revealing mirror. It shows what modern people long for in ancient texts: clear plots, high stakes, vanished powers, secret causes. Yet the older material may be offering something more difficult and more human. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian myths preserve a civilization's deep awareness that order is exhausting authority, is fragile, and sacred closeness can fade, without anyone ever receiving a satisfying explanation. You can feel that truth now as you stand in imagination among the baked walls and stepped platforms in a city where every structure has needed repair and every promise has been tested by weather war or time. The evidence we do have points to a people who knew how near collapse could be and how much labor it took to keep the world from slipping into disorder. One interpretation is that the gods in their literature reflect that same pressure. Even divine rule appears strained, negotiated, and costly. If later readers turn that into the story of an unwinnable war and a final departure, perhaps they were not inventing the unease from nothing. They were amplifying it. A popular rumor claims that hidden or untranslated tablets would settle the matter one day and reveal the full lost account. This is suggestive, not conclusive, and it is wiser not to build certainty on imagined evidence. What's broadly accepted is that the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the Anunnaki were real figures in ancient Mesopotamian religion. We know divine conflict and sacred distance are real themes in the texts. We know later storytellers combined these with modern imaginative frameworks to build a larger legend of retreat. Beyond that, the mist returns, and perhaps it should. Because not every ancient story survives to be solved. Some survive to be inhabited, to be walked through slowly like a hot city at dusk or a temple court after the singers have gone. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. But we do not have to banish the mist entirely. It has its own truth. Not a factual truth maybe, but a human one. The fear that power can fail. The fear that order can fray. The fear that what once felt near might one day feel impossibly far away. And so you arrive at the quietest version of the question. Not did they leave in the loud dramatic sense, though, that legend will continue pacing its circle in modern imagination. Not even did they lose a war because the old texts are too layered, too partial, too patient with ambiguity for that kind of neat verdict. The quieter question is this: why did ancient Mesopotamian people so often imagine the relationship between heaven and earth as vulnerable to strained silence and interruption? Most historians agree that the answer lies in the world they actually lived in. Floods came, cities fell, kings failed, shrines went quiet, ritual tried to repair what history kept breaking. And there is something almost tender in that. Human beings standing in dust and heat, arranging bread and oil before an unseen order, insisting the connection still matters. Scribes pressing signs into clay so memory will outlast panic. Builders rebuilding the same wall one more time because collapse, while persuasive, does not get the final word every day. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia endured not because it solved uncertainty, but because it learned how to live alongside it. One interpretation is that this is the true legacy behind all later Anunnaki stories, however wildly they wander. Not hidden empire, not secret escape route. Endurance under a sky that rarely explains itself. Now the edges of the city begin to blur in the heat, and your thoughts can blur with them. The temple steps lose their sharpness. The canal turns from silver to pale gold. Voices become softer, less distinct, like words heard from another courtyard, another century. And you let the stronger claims loosen their grip. You let the mystery settle back into its proper shape, which is not a headline but a horizon. You imagine the tablets again, small and stubborn under museum light, their wedges pressed by hands that are long gone. They do not shout, they do not rush, they do not beg to be turned into certainty. They offer names, laments, decrees, fragments, silences. They offer a world where gods feel near and far at once, where order is praised because disorder is always nearby, where the sacred can blaze, withdraw, and return in ways no one fully masters. So you let the city breathe around you one last time. Warm brick, reed mats, faint water, a pigeon shifting in a high niche, the dry sweetness of dust, the softness of distance settling over everything that once seemed immediate. And as the scene grows quieter, the old fear inside the legend also softens. Perhaps the Anunnaki left. Perhaps that is only a later story built from older grief. Perhaps the real answer is smaller and sadder and more beautiful, that ancient people knew what it meant to feel the nearness of meaning, and also what it meant when that nearness seemed to recede. You do not need to solve it now. You only need to rest beside it for a moment. Let the temples stand where they stand. Let the broken tablets keep their missing lines. Let the gods, whatever they once meant to those who named them, remain partly in shadow. The city grows quieter, the river keeps moving, the light lifts and thins, and somewhere beyond the reach of certainty, the last lamps of the departed seem less like evidence and more like memory fading gently across the plain, until all that remains is the hush of clay, the patience of history, and the slow comfort of not needing the final answer tonight.